The first thing Myra Okafor noticed was that the ore counters had stopped ticking. It was a small thing, the kind of small thing that only mattered to someone who had spent enough years listening to a station breathe to notice when its rhythm changed. Kestrel ran on rhythms like that, the low hum of the recycled air scrubbers, the distant clang of the belt tugs docking every 90 minutes on a schedule as reliable as tide, the soft, steady clicking of the intake counters as raw or came off the tugs and into the refinery queue. None of it was dramatic. None of it was meant to be noticed at all. That was rather the point of good infrastructure, Myra had always thought. The best systems were the ones nobody ever had reason to think about. She had worked the manifest desk on Kestrel Station for 6 years, long enough that the soft clicking of the intake counters had become something she heard the way she heard her own pulse, always there, never noticed, until it wasn't. She looked up from her terminal. The big board above the cargo bay, the one that tracked raw or coming off the asteroid tugs, sat frozen on a number that hadn't moved in 11 seconds. "Systems," she said. "Talk to me." The station's administrative voice answered in its usual mild tone. "Intake Conveyor 3 has been placed in manual hold. Authorization, Dockmaster override." Nobody told me about a hold. Correct. No advance notice was logged. Myra frowned and pulled up the docking ring on her secondary display. A ship was coupling to bay for that hadn't been on the day's schedule 6 minutes ago. Long, grey, blunt-nosed, the kind of profile that belonged to a Courier enforcement corvette, the sort of vessel that showed up when the large Concorde wanted to remind a small trade outpost exactly where it sat in the hierarchy. Kestrel Station wasn't much to look at, and Myra had long ago stopped minding that. It was a refinery hub built around a slow, tired asteroid belt on the edge of Concorde-administered space, the kind of place that existed to turn raw or into something a bigger ship could sell somewhere more interesting. 6,000 permanent residents, most of them human, a scattering of other species who'd taken postings here because the pay was decent and nobody with any real ambition wanted the assignment. The corridors smelled faintly of recycled air and hot metal. The gravity plating on Deck 3 had a stutter in it that everyone had learned to step around without thinking. It was not, by any reasonable measure, a place that mattered to anyone beyond the people who lived there. She had seen Courier ships dock before. Routine tariff audits, mostly. Boring, paperwork heavy, over in an hour, conducted by junior officers who clearly considered the posting a professional insult and made sure everyone around them understood it too. This felt different. The Corvette hadn't requested a berth. It had simply taken one, shouldering aside a scheduled parts freighter that was still broadcasting an irritated hold pattern on the traffic channel, its pilot's voice climbing steadily in pitch as he demanded to know who had authorized the reroute. "Nobody's answering him," Myra muttered, watching the freighter's frustrated traffic chatter scroll past on a side panel. "Systems, who cleared that Corvette into bay 4 ahead of scheduled traffic." "The docking authorization originated from the vessel itself," Systems said. "Priority override, Concorde enforcement code. No station approval was required." That was new. In 6 years, Myra had never once seen an incoming ship simply claim priority over the docking queue without so much as a courtesy ping to traffic control first. She sat with that thought a moment longer than it probably deserved, the small, nagging unease of a scheduling irregularity that hadn't yet become anything worse. Down on the cargo deck, 40 meters below the manifest desk's viewport, Myra watched a small unmanned courier drone detach from its cradle and slide out through the departure lock, exactly on schedule, exactly like it did every 6 hours, carrying a routine shipment of refined ore samples toward the relay buoy at the edge of the system. Nobody paid it any attention. It was the least interesting thing happening in that moment. Myra barely registered it herself, except to note, with the small satisfaction of someone whose job depended on things running on time, that at least something today was going according to plan. She did not know, not yet, that the drone leaving on schedule was the only thing that mattered. Before the summons came, Myra had a few minutes left to spend the way she'd spent every other shift for 6 years, half watching the docking ring, half thinking about the small, unremarkable business of her own life. She'd promised her sister back on Earth she'd call this evening, station time permitting, to talk about nothing in particular, the way they did every few weeks, a habit that had outlasted the actual distance between them by several light years and a small fortune in relay fees. She'd been meaning, for months, to finally put in for the senior manifest coordinator posting on Holden Station. One system over, better pay, marginally more interesting work. She kept not doing it. There was a comfort in Kestrel's unremarkableness that she hadn't quite been able to name, until this exact morning, when the unremarkableness cracked open like a shell she hadn't known was thin. Down the corridor, she heard Dahlia Reyes's voice before she saw her. The engineer had a habit of narrating her own troubleshooting out loud, half for her own benefit and half, Myra suspected, because the sound of another voice made the long solitary hours in the conduit crawlspaces more bearable. Systems. Why is intake 3 refusing manual override from my terminal 2? Manual hold was authorized above your access tier, System said. Above I'm the chief engineer. What tier is above mine on a maintenance conveyor? Nobody answered her, and Dahlia rounded the corner into the manifest bay a moment later, wiping grease from her hands with a rag that had clearly given up on being useful several shifts ago, her expression somewhere between professional irritation and the first, faint stirrings of genuine unease. Tell me you know something I don't, she said to Myra. I know there's an unscheduled ship at Bay 4 and nobody asked traffic control's permission to put it there. Dahlia's face did something complicated. That's not better. Director Solis is requesting all senior staff to the ops deck, System said. Myra had worked under Amara Solis for 3 years. The director ran Kestrel with the unhurried calm of someone who had never once, in Myra's memory, raised a voice. Even now, summoned along with a dozen other staff into the cramped ops room overlooking the docking ring, Solis stood with her arms loosely folded, watching the Coran corvette's crew disembark on the monitor like she was watching weather roll in. Mildly interesting. Not alarming. They're claiming a smuggling inspection, said Priya Anand, the shift supervisor, reading off a tablet. Contraband refinement additive, unlisted on our manifests. They want full cargo access and personnel questioning. Do we have unlisted contraband? Solis asked. No. Then this will be short, Solis said, and something in the flatness of her voice made Myra glance sideways at her, though she couldn't have said why. 11 Coran soldiers came through the connecting corridor a few minutes later, led by an officer with pale gold markings tattooed across the ridge of his brow. Coran rank insignia, Myra knew, though she'd never bothered to memorize what the different patterns meant. Their boots struck the deck plating in a synchronized rhythm that felt deliberate, almost theatrical, the kind of entrance meant to be heard through 3 closed bulkheads before it was ever seen. Behind them trailed a pair of hovering recorder drones, small and unobtrusive, clearly meant to document whatever came next for whatever purposes Concord enforcement records were kept. Myra had never stood in a room with this many armed strangers before. Her hands found the edge of the console in front of her and gripped it, not for support exactly, just for something solid to hold onto while her pulse worked its way up into her throat. The lead officer introduced himself as Subcommander Vrastel Doon, in a voice that made the introduction sound like a formality he resented having to perform for a species he didn't consider worth the courtesy. Your station has been flagged, Doon said, for irregularities in refined or export volumes over the last 2 cycles. This is a compliance matter. Cooperate, and it will be resolved quickly. We export exactly what we mine, Solis said. You're welcome to audit the logs. I intend to. Doon's eyes moved across the ops room, across the humans gathered there, with the particular kind of contempt Myra had felt from Coran officials before, not hatred, nothing so passionate. Just the flat disregard of someone looking at furniture that had, for reasons unclear to him, been allowed to speak. You people, he said, almost conversationally, always assume compliance will save you. It rarely does. He said it the way a person might comment on the weather. No heat behind it, no real malice, just a flat statement of something he considered obvious. Myra had grown up around enough Concord officials to recognize the tone. It wasn't cruelty exactly. It was the comfortable, unthinking certainty of someone who had never once had to consider that the people in front of him might remember what he said, or that it might, eventually, cost him something. She glanced at the other station staff gathered along the back wall of the ops room, Dahlia Reyes from engineering, arms crossed, jaw tight, 2 junior manifest clerks she barely knew by name, both of them very carefully not making eye contact with any of the Coran soldiers now spreading out to secure the room's exits. Everyone wore the same expression, she realized. Not fear exactly. Something closer to the particular, exhausted patience of people who had been dismissed too many times before to be surprised by being dismissed again. Myra felt something cold settle in her stomach, a small crack of understanding that this was not, in fact, going to be short. They spent 4 hours going through the manifests. Myra sat at her desk answering questions from a junior Coran officer who clearly found the entire exercise beneath him, reciting export tonnage figures she had triple-checked 100 times over the years, watching him scowl at numbers that refused to be anything other than exactly what she said they were. Around her, other staff endured the same slow grinding process, questions asked twice, 3 times, as though repetition might shake loose a different answer. Cycle 41, the officer said, tapping a stylus against his tablet with visible irritation. Explain the 11% variance between projected and delivered refined tonnage. Tug 3 had a coolant fault, Myra said, for the second time. It's in the maintenance log. 4 days lost to repair, then a slower re-entry burn to compensate for the damaged manifold. The variance accounts for exactly that, down to the hour. Convenient that your equipment fails in ways that always happen to explain your numbers. It's not convenient, Myra said, feeling something small and stubborn rise in her chest despite herself. It's just what happened. You can check the diagnostic logs from the tug itself if you don't believe the station's copy. He didn't check the diagnostic logs from the tug itself. He moved on to cycle 42 instead, and asked her to explain a variance there too, in exactly the same flat, disbelieving tone, as though her previous answer had never happened at all. By the third repetition, Myra understood that the questions weren't really about the numbers. They were a kind of pressure, applied steadily and without any particular hurry, on the theory that eventually something would crack loose that wasn't actually there. By the 5th hour, Sub-Commander Dune's patience, thin to begin with, had worn through entirely. Your numbers are clean, he told Solus, standing in the ops room with his arms behind his back, which tells me only that your falsification is competent, not that it doesn't exist. Or it tells you the numbers are accurate, Solus said. Warden Thane does not send enforcement vessels on guesses. Director. There is a discrepancy somewhere in this station's operations, and I intend to find it, however long that requires. Dune's gaze flicked toward the docking ring monitor, where his Corvette sat coupled to bay for like a tick. He began pacing then, a short, tight loop between the main console and the observation window, the restless motion of a man who had convinced himself that momentum alone might produce the answer that 4 hours of legitimate audit had failed to. Every cycle this station reports export figures that align precisely with projected output.
No overruns.
No shortfalls beyond what your maintenance logs can explain. Do you understand how statistically improbable that is, Director, across 11 consecutive cycles? I understand that we run a tight operation, Solus said. I'm not sure why that's suspicious rather than simply competent. Because competence this consistent is rare, Dune said, and rarity, in my experience, is usually explained by something other than virtue. In the meantime, this station's outbound shipments are suspended. Nothing leaves Kestrel until my inspection concludes. That includes the courier that already departed 6 hours ago, Priya said carefully. It's past the relay buoy by now. We can't recall it. Dune's jaw tightened at that, a small, involuntary flicker of irritation, as though the drone's departure was a personal affront rather than routine logistics. Then I will note the discrepancy for the record. Everything after this moment stays. He stalked off toward the far end of the ops room to confer with his subordinates, and Priya sagged slightly against the console, letting out a breath she'd clearly been holding through the entire exchange. Myra drifted over to stand beside her, keeping her voice low. You've dealt with Concord audits before, Myra said. Is this normal? The tone, I mean. It feels different from the tariff inspections. Tariff inspections are bored people doing paperwork, Priya said. This is something else. I've seen Dune's type before, on a placement I did out near the Verdane Relay a few years back. Officers who get sent to the unimportant postings and spend the whole time looking for a reason to matter. He wants to find something here. Whether it's actually here or not is almost beside the point. That's a comforting thought. I didn't say it to comfort you. Priya managed a thin smile despite herself. I said it so you'd stop expecting this to make sense on its own terms. It's not really about or tonnage. It never was. Across the room, Sola stood near the main display with her arms folded, watching Dune confer with his officers with an expression Myra still couldn't quite place. Not worry, not quite calm either, something more like careful attention, the way a person watches whether they've studied long enough to read the early signs of, even if they can't yet say exactly which direction the storm will break. Myra didn't think much of the exchange at the time. It seemed like a minor bureaucratic snag, The kind of thing that happened whenever Concord officials tried to impose sudden holds on a system that had been running smoothly without their oversight. She had no way of knowing that Dune's irritation was the first small crack in a plan he didn't know existed, that the drone he couldn't recall was, at that moment, sliding past the relay buoy and beginning to broadcast. What she noticed instead, working late into the station's arbitrary night cycle, was Director Solis. Solis had not left the ops room in 9 hours. She hadn't eaten, as far as Myra could tell, hadn't so much as sat down for more than a few minutes at a stretch. And she did not look tired. She looked, if anything, like someone watching a countdown she'd memorized a long time ago, waiting for a number she already knew was coming. "You're not worried," Myra said, catching her alone near the observation window sometime past midnight, station time. Solis considered the question longer than it warranted. "I'm not worried about what Dune can do to our records," she said finally. "Records can be argued with. I'd be more worried if this were only about records." "What else would it be about?" "Go get some sleep, Myra. Tomorrow's going to be a long day too." It wasn't reassuring. Myra noted, with the same instinct that had made her glance sideways at Solis in the ops room hours earlier, that it wasn't meant to be. She walked back to her quarters along the ring corridor, past the small observation blister whereof shift workers usually gathered to watch the belt tugs come and go, empty now except for a Coran soldier stationed at the junction, watching her pass with an expression she couldn't read behind his visor. The station felt different at night with armed strangers walking its corridors, smaller, somehow, though nothing about its actual dimensions had changed. She found herself walking a little faster than usual, and hating herself a little for it. She didn't sleep much. Station quarters were thin-walled enough that she could hear boots in the corridor at odd hours, Coran patrols, moving with the deliberate weight of people who wanted to be heard, wanted the station's civilian population lying awake and aware of exactly how outnumbered they were. At one point, close to 0200, she heard raised voices 2 doors down, a Coran soldier and one of the belt tug pilots, a quiet, soft-spoken man named Osei who Myra had shared a dozen unremarkable shifts with over the years, arguing about whether he was permitted to walk to the galley for water without an escort. The argument ended with the soldier physically blocking the corridor, and Osei retreating back into his quarters without his water, and Myra lying very still in her bunk afterward, listening to her own heartbeat, thinking about how quickly a place could stop belonging to the people who lived in it. Around 0300, ship time, she gave up entirely on sleep and pulled up the public compact news feeds on her tablet, scrolling through the usual traffic of trade disputes and border filings between large Concord member worlds, looking for anything that might explain why a routine tariff audit had turned into an armed occupation of her station's cargo bay. She found nothing. Kestrel wasn't important enough to make the news. That, more than anything Dune had said, was what finally let her fall asleep, the small, foolish comfort of believing that nothing important enough to matter could possibly be happening to her. She woke 4 hours later to the sound of the station's alert klaxon, and the sound of something that took her a full 10 seconds to identify as gunfire. For those 10 seconds she lay frozen in her bunk, some old animal part of her brain insisting the sound must be something else, a pressure valve venting, a maintenance drone dropping a tool case, anything other than what it actually was. Then the klaxon cycled again, and System's voice cut through her quad's speaker with none of its usual mildness at all. "All personnel, security incident in progress on the ops deck. Remain in quarters until cleared." Myra was already pulling on her boots before the message finished playing. She told herself, running for the door, that it was instinct, the same stupid, useless instinct that made people run toward fires instead of away from them. In truth, she barely thought about it at all. She just knew, with a certainty she couldn't have explained, that whatever was happening on the ops deck, she needed to see it for herself rather than wait in the dark listening to second-hand chaos through a speaker. The corridor outside her quarters was chaos in miniature, other station staff emerging half-dressed into the passageway, someone shouting for a medic somewhere up ahead, a Coran soldier at the junction waving people back toward their quarters with a weapon that had clearly, recently, been fired. Myra pushed past him before he could stop her, driven by a mix of fear and stubbornness she didn't examine too closely, and rounded the last corner into the ops corridor just as the smell of ozone and something coppery reached her. By the time Myra reached the ops corridor, 2 Coran soldiers stood blocking it, weapons raised, and Priya Anand was on the floor with her hand pressed hard against her own shoulder, blood seeping between her fingers in slow, dark blooms, staining the pale grey decking beneath her in a spreading, uneven circle. Myra's whole body seemed to lock in place for a half-second, the way it did in nightmares where running felt like wading through something thick and unwilling. Priya's face was grey, her breathing fast and shallow, and for one horrible moment Myra genuinely did not know if her friend was still conscious. She reached for a terminal, one of the soldiers said, in the tone of someone reciting an excuse he'd prepared in advance. Unauthorized access during a compliance freeze. She works here, Myra said, too loud, her voice cracking on the second word. She was doing her job. Inside, the soldier said, and shoved her back through the doorway hard enough that she stumbled into the frame. Inside the ops room, the air had changed entirely from the cautious, procedural tension of the day before. Subcommander Doone stood at the center of it, and whatever patience he'd been rationing out over the manifest audit had run out completely sometime in the night. Myra had never seen a room feel this small before, packed with armed soldiers and frightened civilian staff pressed back against the walls, the overhead lights harsh and unforgiving in a way they never seemed during ordinary shifts. Dahlia stood near the main console, arms raised slightly, palms open, in the universal posture of someone trying very hard not to give anyone a reason to escalate further. She caught Myra's eye across the room and gave the smallest possible shake of her head. A warning, Myra understood, not to say anything, not to move too fast, not to give Doone's already frayed patience anything new to react to. On the main display behind Doone, Myra saw why the room had come apart so completely. Discrepancy located. Read a flagged line item, highlighted in Concord red. 14 shipments over 11 cycles routed through unregistered courier drone. Designation KS Relay 07. Bypassing standard customs telemetry. That drone runs a scheduled maintenance data sync, Sola said, standing with her hands loose at her sides, her voice utterly level despite the blood on the floor 12 feet behind her. It's logged. It's public record. It is not smuggling. It is unregistered with my authority, Doone snapped, which under emergency compliance protocol is sufficient grounds for seizure of this station's operations pending full tribunal review. You have obstructed a lawful inspection. Your staff resisted lawful orders. I am authorized to escalate. Escalate to what, exactly? Doone's communicator crackled at his side before he could answer, a voice speaking rapidly in the clipped, guttural cadence of Korun formal channels. Myra didn't understand the words, but she understood the way Doone's shoulders squared as he listened, the way something in his expression shifted from irritation into something closer to relief, the relief of a man who'd been handed permission he'd already decided to use. Warden Thane has authorized a punitive response fleet, Doone said, switching back to trade common, apparently for the benefit of the humans still gathered in the room, or perhaps simply because cruelty enjoyed an audience. Given this station's demonstrated pattern of concealment and resistance, Kestrel will be placed under full Concord administrative control until such time as. You're seizing the station, Myra said. It wasn't really a question. Her voice came out smaller than she wanted it to. I am correcting it, Doone said. This has always been the trouble with your people. You mistake tolerance for equality. The Concord permitted this station to operate under human administration as a courtesy. Courtesies can be revoked. Priya needs a medic, Myra said, louder than she meant to, her fear finally curdling into something with an edge to it. She's bleeding on your account, Sub-Commander. Whatever paperwork you're building toward, it can wait 10 minutes for that. Doone glanced toward Priya, still on the floor with a junior engineer now kneeling beside her, pressing a folded jacket against the wound with hands that weren't quite steady. Something flickered across his expression, not quite guilt, Myra thought, but perhaps the faint discomfort of a man realizing the mess he'd made was more visible than he'd planned for it to be. A medic will be permitted, he said finally, waving a hand toward one of his own soldiers, once the room is secured. It's secured, Sola said. 11 armed soldiers, 1 director, and 11 civilian staff who have not raised a hand against you at any point. What exactly is left to secure, Sub-Commander? Doone didn't answer immediately. He turned instead toward the flagged line item still glowing on the main display, the unregistered courier drone highlighted in Concord red, and something in his expression tightened further, as though the number itself had personally offended him. You will explain this discrepancy now, Director, or I will have every terminal on this station physically removed and shipped to a Concord forensics facility for analysis. That process typically takes months. Your station's operations will remain suspended for the duration. Months, Solis repeated, and for the first time Myra heard something other than calm in her voice, a thin, dry thread of something almost like amusement, though her expression didn't change at all. You'd shut down an entire refinery hub, cut off or shipments to 11 downstream Concord processing contracts, over a maintenance data sync you haven't actually looked at yet. I am well within my authority to do so. I didn't say you weren't within your authority, Sub-Commander. I said you hadn't looked at it yet. Solus's gaze didn't waver from his. You might want to, before you commit to months. Something in the way he said it, the flat, bored cruelty of a man explaining an obvious truth to furniture, made Myra's fear curdle briefly into something closer to anger. She looked at Solus, expecting to see that anger mirrored back at her. Instead, she found the director watching Dune with an expression Myra had never seen on her before. Not fear. Not even the careful, professional neutrality she usually wore. Something closer to patience. The specific, weary patience of someone watching a mistake unfold exactly as predicted, waiting only for it to finish making itself. 14 shipments, Sola said quietly, almost to herself. You checked 14 shipments and never once asked what the maintenance datasync actually contained. Dune's attention snapped to her. What it contains is irrelevant. It was unregistered. It was public, Sola said. You just never had a reason to look. The station lights flickered, once, and dimmed to the low amber of a system entering a mode Myra had never seen it use before. Not an emergency shutdown, nothing so crude, but something quieter, more deliberate, like a held breath. Systems, Sola said, not raising her voice at all, run full disclosure protocol.
Userezasjen solis actual.
The mild administrative voice that had informed Myra about the frozen or counters 20 hours earlier answered from every speaker in the ops room at once, and for the first time since Myra had started working at Kestrel, it did not sound mild at all. Acknowledged. Node 0 is live. Nothing visibly happened. That was, Myra would think later, the strangest part of it. No weapons rising out of hidden floor panels, no sudden reveal of a warship's teeth beneath a civilian hull. Just a small blue status light on the ops room's main console, one she had walked past 10,000 times without ever once wondering what it did, switching from a dormant grey to a steady, patient blue. Beside her, Priya let out a short, pained breath, half laugh and half wince, as the engineer pressing the jacket to her shoulder muttered something reassuring that neither of them fully believed. The Koran soldiers along the wall shifted uneasily, weapons still raised but their attention now split between the humans in the room and the ambient hum that seemed to have settled over the station's own systems. A low vibration Myra felt more than heard, running through the deck plating beneath her boots. What, Dune said slowly, is Node 0? Solus finally turned to look at him directly, and when she spoke, there was nothing performative left in her voice at all. No diplomatic softness, no careful courtesy for rank. Just plain, tired honesty, the tone of someone setting down a weight she'd been carrying for a very long time. Every human-administered relay station, cargo hauler, and courier drone in Concord space carries the same system, she said. It's called the Chorus. It records everything: sensor data, comms traffic, biometric telemetry, structural damage logs, cryptographically signed, the moment it's captured, in a form that can't be altered afterward without breaking the signature. And it doesn't sit and wait to be asked for. Under specific trigger conditions, unlawful seizure, use of force against unarmed personnel, coercion under false pretext, it broadcasts. Automatically. Redundantly. To every synced node it can reach. That's a fabrication, Dune said. A bluff. Ask your own engineers to authenticate it. Then, Sola said. The signature chain is public standard, the same cryptographic framework the Compact uses for its own treaty records. We didn't invent a new kind of lie, Sub-Commander. We just stopped being the only ones who couldn't prove when someone was telling one. Myra watched Dahlia, still crouched beside Priya, go very still at that, the way a person goes still when a piece of their own daily work suddenly reveals itself to have been something else entirely all along. The maintenance sync, Dahlia said slowly, half to herself. The one I run every 6 hours. I've run that sync 1,000 times. I thought it was routine telemetry for the drone fleet's own diagnostics. It is that too, Sola said. It genuinely is routine telemetry. That's rather the point, Dahlia. It has to be boring enough that nobody ever thinks to ask what else it's carrying. A system that only activates during a crisis draws attention the moment it activates. A system that's been running quietly in the background of ordinary maintenance work for 6 years doesn't draw attention at all, right up until the moment it matters. They're saying it's going to be a whole thing, Priya said, propped up in the station's small infirmary bay, scrolling one-handed through the Compact news feeds that had, over the last 72 hours, become considerably more interested in Kestrel than they'd ever been before. Full oversight hearing. Dune's being formally charged. There's talk of the warden's own appointment coming up for review, given he authorized the fleet before verifying the disclosure himself. Good, Myra said, and meant it more fiercely than she expected to. She scrolled further, her expression flickering between amusement and something more tired underneath it. Apparently, I'm being described in one write-up as a symbol of quiet civilian resilience. I was reaching for a manifest file because a man with a gun told me to. I don't feel very symbolic. Mostly, I feel like my shoulder hurts and I'd like someone to bring me actual food instead of nutrient paste. Myra laughed despite herself, the sound surprising her a little, the first real laugh she'd managed in what felt like a very long stretch of days. I'll see what the galley has left. There's also, Priya added, with the careful, testing tone of someone about to say something she suspected would land badly, a request from 3 separate compact news services for an interview with the logistics supervisor who got shot for reaching toward a terminal. Myra watched her friend's face for a long moment, trying to read what she actually wanted underneath the joke. Do you want to do it? Priya considered the question with more seriousness than Myra expected. I think I want people to understand that it wasn't dramatic, she said finally. I wasn't being brave. I wasn't making some kind of stand. I was reaching for a terminal because a soldier told me to pull up a manifest file, and then a different soldier decided that was suspicious enough to shoot me over. That's the whole story. That's what I want people to actually sit with, how small the moment was, and how close it came to just disappearing afterward, the way it always used to. Myra thought about that for a long time after she left the infirmary. On her way back through the ring corridor, she passed the observation blister where she'd once seen a Koran soldier standing guard, now empty again, the belt tugs visible through the viewport moving in their slow, familiar rhythm, hauling or the way they had every day for as long as she'd worked here. It looked, from the outside, like nothing at all had happened. She supposed that was, in its own way, the strangest part of it, how quickly the ordinary reasserted itself over something that had nearly gotten someone killed. She found solace later that evening in the same observation lounge where they'd had their brief, strange conversation on the first night of the occupation, watching the same starfield through the same viewport, though the tension in her shoulders had finally, visibly eased. You knew this whole thing would work, Myra said, settling into the seat across from her without being invited, the way she'd have never dared to a week earlier. From the very start. You weren't scared, not really. You were just waiting. I was scared, Sola said. Just not of the fleet. I've watched this exact shape of confrontation happen a dozen times over the years, on a dozen different outposts, always ending the same way before the chorus existed, an inconvenient incident, an armed authority with every incentive to make it disappear, and no way for anyone outside the room to ever know for certain what actually happened. What I was afraid of, this time, was that it would happen again exactly the same way, and the only difference would be that this time we had a system that was supposed to stop it, and it wouldn't work when it mattered. Myra let the silence sit a while before asking the question that had been building in her since the ops room, since the moment the blue light on the console had switched on and changed everything about what she thought she understood of her own workplace. Why didn't you tell everyone? Before Dune docked. Before any of this happened. Solus was quiet for a moment, watching the reshaped patrol formation still visible through the viewport, distant now, no longer weapons ready. Because the system only works if the people living inside it are genuinely, unrehearsed afraid when something goes wrong, she said. If Priya had known she was walking around wired into a witness network, some part of her would have performed for it, consciously or not. The fear in that footage needed to be real, because real fear is the thing nobody can fake convincingly enough to fool an authentication check. You were never bait, Myra. None of you were. You were just what an honest station full of honest people actually looks like when something goes wrong around them. That was always going to be worth more than any weapon we could have hidden instead. ______________________________________________________________________________________________________2 weeks later, Myra stood on the same manifest desk platform where this had all begun, watching the ore counters click steadily upward again, the sound she'd once heard without noticing now impossible to hear as anything but ordinary. A parts freighter sat docked at Bay 4, where the Koran corvette had once forced its way in uninvited. Down on the cargo deck, a courier drone slid free of its cradle and out through the departure lock, exactly on schedule, exactly as it always did. This time, Myra watched it the whole way out. Director Solis found her there, holding a data tablet with the tribunal's preliminary findings, freshly released to every Concord member world that morning. Dune had been formally stripped of rank, facing a lengthy prosecution under Concord military conduct law. Warden Thane's authorization of the punitive fleet, issued before he'd verified the underlying disclosure, had cost him his regional command entirely, replaced by an official whose first formal act had been opening negotiations for a compact-wide treaty amendment, one requiring independent, tamper-proof documentation standards on any enforcement action taken against a member station. "They're calling it the Kestrel Amendment," Sola said, handing Myra the tablet. "That's a strange kind of legacy for a station nobody outside this sector had ever heard of a month ago." Priya had rejoined them by the manifest desk, her arm still in its brace, scrolling through the same findings on her own tablet with the faint, disbelieving smile she'd worn ever since the medical transport had first carried her away. "They interviewed the tribunal's lead investigator this morning," she said. She called it the incident that finally made the cost of denial higher than the cost of honesty. "I nearly choked on my coffee. That's going to look very strange stitched into a treaty amendment 100 years from now. And none of it happened because anyone here was trying to make history. It happened because a man decided a bleeding logistics supervisor was less important than finishing his audit on schedule." Dahlia joined them a moment later, still smelling faintly of the coolant she'd spent the morning wrestling with. One more ordinary repair among the 1,000 ordinary repairs that kept Kestrel running regardless of what history decided to make of it. "The investigator's not wrong," she said, settling against the console. "I've been fielding calls from 3 other station engineering teams since yesterday, all of them wanting to know how the maintenance sync actually works so they can explain it to their own crews without giving away anything the compact hasn't already made public. Feels strange, doesn't it? A year ago nobody outside this refinery cared what I did for a living. Now I'm apparently a minor authority on cryptographic witness infrastructure." "Wear it well," Sola said, with the faint, dry amusement of someone who had clearly expected exactly this outcome long before any of the rest of them had. "Most important legacies are," Sola said. "Nobody plans to become the incident a treaty gets named after. You just happen to be standing in the room when the record finally gets long enough that people stop being able to look away from it." Myra scrolled through the findings a while longer, watching the language shift, clause by careful clause, from the old, familiar wording, disputed incident, pending further investigation, insufficient corroboration, into something new, something that read less like an argument and more like a simple accounting of fact. She thought about all the disputes that must have come before this one, all the outposts and stations and cargo runs where something had gone wrong and simply vanished into exactly that old, familiar language, disputed and insufficient and eventually, quietly, forgotten. How many other Dunes were there, she asked, before the chorus, before any of this could be proven? Solas's expression didn't change, but something in her voice went very quiet. "More than I'd like to count. That's rather the reason the system exists at all, Myra. We didn't build it because we expected to win an argument. We built it because we got tired of losing arguments that should never have needed to be won in the first place, because the truth of what happened to us should never have depended on whether anyone stronger felt like admitting it." Priya, listening quietly beside them, shifted her weight to favor her uninjured shoulder. "I keep thinking about what would have happened if the chorus hadn't existed," she said. "If Dune had shot me, and it had just been my word against his report. I know exactly how that would have gone. I've heard enough stories from enough other outposts to know exactly how that would have gone." Nobody answered her, because nobody needed to. It was, Myra understood now, the entire reason any of this had been necessary in the first place, not some grand strategic gambit aimed at winning a single confrontation, but a slow, patient refusal to keep losing the same argument in the same way, over and over, for as long as anyone could remember. Priya excused herself a little later, citing a physical therapy session she was already visibly dreading, and Myra watched her go with something that felt almost like pride, though she couldn't have said exactly what she was proud of. Her friend had walked into an armed confrontation doing nothing more heroic than her ordinary job, had been shot for it, and had come out the other side still more interested in getting real food from the galley than in being anyone's symbol. There was something in that, Myra thought, that mattered more than any tribunal finding or treaty amendment ever could: the simple, stubborn refusal to let a single violent afternoon rewrite the shape of an ordinary life. Myra looked back out at the departure lock, at the empty cradle where the courier drone had been a few minutes earlier, already gone, already carrying its quiet, patient record out toward the edge of the system, the way it did every 6 hours, the way it always had, long before anyone outside the station had ever had a reason to wonder what it was truly for. "Is there another one?" she asked. "Another chorus node, somewhere else, waiting the same way this one was. Solace allowed herself, for the first time since the corvette had first docked uninvited at Bay 4, something close to a genuine smile. There are thousands, she said, in every system we've ever been dismissed in, waiting, quietly, for exactly as long as it takes. Myra thought about that for a long moment, turning it over the way she'd once turned over the strange, unremarkable sound of a departing courier drone without ever imagining what it actually carried. She thought about the belt tug pilot 2 doors down who hadn't been allowed to get his own water, about Priya's shoulder still healing beneath its brace, about every quiet, dismissive comment she'd absorbed from Concord officials over 6 years without ever once being able to prove any of it had happened the way she remembered. None of that had changed, not really, not in any way she could point to and call finished. But something underneath it had shifted, the way the floor of a room shifts almost imperceptibly when the foundation beneath it finally settles into place after years of quiet strain. It doesn't feel like winning, she said finally. Not the way I thought it would. It isn't supposed to, Sola said. Winning implies the fight is over. This was never a fight, Myra. It was a correction. Corrections don't feel like victories. They just feel like the world finally agreeing to be honest about what was already true. Myra stayed a while longer after Solus left, alone with the viewport and the slow, unhurried traffic of the docking ring below, tugs coming and going, freighters clearing customs without incident, the ordinary machinery of a small refinery station simply doing what it had always done. She thought about calling her sister tonight, station time permitting, the way she'd meant 2 weeks ago before all of this began, and finding, for once, that she actually had something worth telling her. Down below, the ore counters kept ticking, steady and unremarkable, the small ordinary sound of a station simply going about its day, and somewhere beyond the relay buoy, invisible and unhurried, the record kept moving outward, carrying with it the plain, unglamorous, unbreakable promise that from now on, nothing done to them would ever again have the chance to simply disappear.